Hey guys, Philosophossum. So anyways, in this video, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, is going to explain to us why he believes that the COVID-19 pandemic is the end of libertarianism. Yeah, this should be good.
So, Sagar, what's on your radar?
Today is a dark time in America. There's no getting around it. Millions are filing for unemployment. They're facing lost wages, wondering how they might pay their bills, pay their student loans, put food on the table for their kids, so much more. But there's one speck of good news that emerged from this crisis, and that is the final and complete death of libertarianism on the right and on the left.
You know, I've actually heard this argument before, that the COVID-19 pandemic is somehow the death knell of libertarian ideology. And all I can think is, what the hell are these people talking about? As far as I'm concerned, this whole fiasco is a vindication of everything libertarians have been saying. I mean, what is this whole situation going on right now, if not absolute undeniable proof? The vast amounts of destruction and disaster that can happen when you expect government to solve all your problems for you.
Right now, Republican President Donald Trump is proposing a $1 trillion stimulus package for the American economy, $200 billion more than that was offered by Barack Obama in 2008. He's being pushed by Republican Senator Josh Hawley to increase the payments proposed to working families to thousands of dollars a month provided by the federal government. Others, like Senator Marco Rubio, are proposing that the federal government provide billions to small or medium-sized businesses, and that as long as they use it to keep their workers on payrolls, they don't even have to pay it back to the federal government.
Okay, so who wants to bet that they still don't have to pay it back, even if they don't use it to keep their employees on payroll?
Intercept journalist Lee Fang summed it up quite well, saying, quote, Trump suspending mortgage foreclosures.
You know, a lot of people are demanding that we suspend collection of things like rent and mortgage payments because people are struggling to get by. But aren't landlords and financial workers also kind of struggling to get by? Wouldn't it be kind of unfair to screw them over too? And it's kind of convenient that this whole moratorium on debts only applies to private sector debt collection. For some reason, the IRS still has the right to screw over the little guy during the pandemic, or however the left wants to portray it as.
Demanding cash payments to Americans, now invoking the Defense Production Act to force private firms to produce needed supplies is incredible.
Wait, before people were criticizing Donald Trump for not invoking the Defense Production Act. I mean, I'm far from a Trump fanboy, but it does get on my nerves when people throw all these inconsistent criticisms at him. And well, the truth is that he hasn't been invoking the Defense Production Act, and that's not because he's selfish, doesn't care about the pandemic or whatever. It's because he hasn't needed to. Companies have been voluntarily stepping forward to volunteer to produce things for the federal government. The power to force somebody to do something is kind of redundant when that person's voluntarily willing to do it anyways.
It's kind of a shell shock for anybody who reported on any economic policies in the Obama years. Long gone are the days of people holding up pocketbook constitutions and keyboard warriors on Twitter railing against taxpayer bailouts for anyone.
Has this guy been living in a cave making out with a bear for the past year or so? Because that's the only possible way I can imagine that someone would see what's going on right now and draw the conclusion that criticism of government is on a decline.
Because they should have had the good sense and personal responsibility to anticipate a global pandemic in which we were all literally forced to stay inside and not spend money.
You know, conveniently enough, he doesn't seem to be mentioning the reason why everyone is forced to stay inside and not spend money. The reason that people are forced to stay inside and not spend money is because they were being ordered to by the very government that you're expecting to come in and solve the problem.
The debate on Capitol Hill today is not whether we should bail people and affected industries out, but what strings we might want to attach to that money for businesses, or exactly how many billions they want to get.
Yeah, like the government was ever hesitating to hand out bailout money before this pandemic. And let's be honest, there's pretty much a guarantee that the government's just going to hand this money the fuck out. Like they're going to worry about attaching strings to it at all. The only string they're going to attach to this bailout money, if any, is, are you a crony who supports my campaign?
The corporate Democrats were not ready for this, as I covered in my radar yesterday. They are completing the Hillary maneuver by working for shedding average Americans from their political coalition and relying on the votes of rich people in the suburbs, Wall Street, and their African American voting base. They've left workers out in the cold in their worst time of need with a fake paid sick leave bill, and Chuck Schumer galvanizing Democratic support for less relief of American families than the GOP.
Let's be honest, the Democratic Party never gave a rat's ass about fucking workers. They're just not pretending to care as much as the Republicans are.
It's a welcome development. When the right was faced with crisis, they made the final break away from the libertarian deadweights that have weighed them down politically for so long.
So you're using the fact that Republicans are willing to give increasing amounts of bailout money to businesses as some sort of evidence that libertarianism is dead? Well, first of all, the Republicans were never libertarian to begin with. Second of all, Republicans have always been in support of bailing out big companies, long before the pandemic. See, Republicans claim to be against socialism, but if you look at the actual policies that they usually push, they're actually usually just as socialist as the left wing. Republicans and Democrats both support socialism. The only difference is who they want that money going to.
And as Crystal covered in her radar yesterday, we don't ask questions about how we're going to pay for each individual line item of this bailout crisis.
Well, you really should be, because as I've mentioned in previous videos, the problem with using stimulus money to perpetuate the lockdowns is that if people aren't working, if the economy is being unproductive and nobody's earning an income, who are you going to tax? The only other possibility is to just print the money out of thin air, but that leads to hyperinflation, which causes all sorts of problems.
Because we understand that a pandemic is the definition of a problem that affects all of us.
Yes, I'm well aware that this is a problem that affects all of us, but that doesn't really address the issue. If the economy's not being productive and generating wealth, where's the stimulus money going to come from? Heck, the government has a hard time keeping a balanced budget with a productive economy.
And there is no way to personal responsibility or individualism your way out of this one.
But what about the masks and social distancing? I thought those were examples of individuals exercising personal responsibility to try and mitigate the pandemic, are they not? Or at least the actual viral pandemic. If you're talking about the government power grab pandemic, then yeah, there are ways to exercise your personal responsibility to get around it. Business owners all over the country are exercising their personal responsibility to say, the well-being of myself and my community that I serve is more important than the arbitrary edicts of some jackboot in an office somewhere. So they're exercising their personal responsibility to stand up to government and say, no, we're not closing. And there's actually been quite a few victories that have come out of this. For example, a lot of restaurants have actually sued their health departments for the right to stay open and won. It's a prime example of people using personal responsibility to put what's fair or moral above the edicts of government.
The way that political change happens in this country is maddening. You slog away, you can talk into the ether, you shout and you yell and more for years and years and years and years, and nothing ever happens.
Yeah, government is a tedious and inefficient way to get things accomplished. You're making our point there, buddy.
But then, in a span of just a few months, literally, the entire world can change. That's where we are today. The right is ditching libertarianism in a flash in the pan.
You know, when people say that Republicans are libertarian or conservatives are libertarian or libertarians lean right, my initial response is, what the fuck planet has this person been living on? I can list off probably at least 10 things that conservatives want that libertarians are against. And some of the biggest expansions of the Fed in history have actually happened under Republican presidents.
They're accepting the idea that when the public good is threatened, it is okay to act in the public interests economically.
Well, sure, you can act in a public interest economically. I mean, there are private sector charities and nonprofits. Just don't steal money to do it.
The corporate wing of the Democratic Party is learning that their lip service to working people while selling them out for nearly a generation isn't going to be enough anymore. Sure, they looked fine when they were posed up against people who literally didn't believe in public policy, but now they're actually going to have to fight on the merits. And it appears that they've made their choice. They want to be the party of suburban preferred incremental change and of nothing will fundamentally change loving Wall Street.
I love how this guy somehow gets the idea that big corporations and Wall Street are somehow adverse to big government. You know, by expanding the authority of the government to issue bailouts to big companies or issue regulations to make it harder to compete with them, that big corporations are somehow against this.
Sound familiar? The future of American politics is now one that we advocate for on this show. Hating the elites of the country with everything that we've got.
Unless it's elites that you agree with, I'd imagine. Whenever people say they hate the elites, they hate the people in charge. What they're really saying is they hate the elites that they don't approve of.
And hating that, and having both sides fight for the interests of working Americans.
Great, so you're going to get rid of things like minimum wage, mandatory benefits, regulations on unions, other government programs that screw over workers?
Banished forever are those who bemoan taxpayer-funded bailouts to people who are standing on the edge of a cliff at no fault of their own.
Yeah, they're standing on the edge of a cliff thanks to the very people that you want to bail them out.
Their ideology is finally revealed as ridiculous to the very people who it matters most to, the voters. And at least that's the silver lining that I can find for today.
So the people who force you to close your business and ruin your life for a disease with a less than 2% mortality rate, the same people you trust to bail you out of this. And you think we're being ridiculous.
Sagar, I'm old enough to remember. In fact, I was running for Congress in 2010 in the Tea Party wave, which was in part like a backlash. It was part of this whole like, oh, Obama's a socialist and how dare you have an economic stimulus, which, by the way, was like a third tax cuts was the stimulus. It was the most like neoliberal, centrist, corporatist, moderate thing you could possibly imagine. Obviously insufficient to the task.
Yeah, tax cuts aren't corporatist. Tax cuts are literally just letting people keep more of their money. Corporatism are things that specifically benefit corporations over other smaller businesses. Examples of this would be bailouts, subsidies, regulations that make it harder to compete with them.
Since unemployment went up to 10%. And so to watch the evolution between that moment and now, when you have any Republicans saying, yes, let's go forward with cash payments, no, even that is insufficient, is kind of mind-blowing.
Really, the fact that Republicans are advocating for corporate bailouts is mind-blowing to you? Have you seen the policies of any Republican president since Reagan?
I mean, of course, there's like an obvious level of hypocrisy here. Now that it's their guy in the White House, they feel differently about it.
Oh, bitch, please. Both sides do that. Like back when Bush was in office, all the liberals were complaining about him invading Iraq. But then when Obama was in office, they seemed rather silent about his drone strikes.
But there has also been a genuine sort of changing of the guard and change of heart in terms of the underlying view of government and government's ability to set policy and agenda that could actually help working people.
Literally nothing the government does helps working people. Regulations such as minimum wage and mandatory benefits make it a pain in the ass for businesses to hire people, and certain types of licensing laws and other red tape make it harder for people to start their own business. Regulations on unions also make it harder for you to bargain for better conditions. Once you are actually earning money, the government takes a portion of it to spend on whatever the fuck they want, and a portion of your paycheck you do get to keep has the purchasing power of it reduced by monetary deflation and regulations increasing the cost of the goods that you need to buy. Literally the best thing you can do for workers in this country is get rid of the government.
The thing that I wonder about from you is like, you still have a lot of, and we've seen in the Trump administration, even though he ran on this more populist agenda, he and his administration have very much been influenced by that Chamber of Commerce wing of the party. The corporate tax cut obviously is the most, clear-cut example of that. So do you think after the crisis that the party continues in the Chamber of Commerce libertarian direction, or do you think that they hold on to some of this populism that they've turned to in this crisis?
There's this weird myth that people seem to believe that libertarianism was somehow invented by the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is kind of ridiculous when you consider that the idea of individual rights goes back to the Enlightenment, as in long before the Chamber of Commerce even existed.
I think the populism will hold on for this reason, which is that Trump made the kind of a Faustian bargain in the beginning with Gary Cohn and many of these other people who convinced him that his political popularity would be tied to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And so he and all of his administration, from an economic policy perspective, were obsessed with increasing GDP numbers and keeping the stock market blowing out, despite the fact that it's basically against what he ran on in the first place. But what I think happened is that whenever he realized that we were in the midst of this complete crisis, whenever we have people like Larry Kudlow going on trying to, boost markets and ended up dropping them by 2,000 points. I mean, look, the Dow Jones is actually now at a lower point than when Trump took office. And that's why I think that his positioning has changed so much. He's now talking about how he's a wartime president, and that's invoking the Defense Production Act in order to spin up masks from private companies. I mean,
so you actually think that a virus with a less than 2% mortality rate is in any way comparable to being in a war zone? I actually have friends who served in the army and actually got deployed to combat. Like, they had bullets fly past them within inches of their face. Like, this guy's such an arrogant, privileged little shit. It's not even funny.
These are good. And I mean, from my view, these are things I've been trying to advocate for on the right now for a couple of years now. And I think what ended up happening is you realize that, look, in terms of the stock market, that's gone. They tried everything they possibly could in order to try and juice the markets up. But as we said here from the very beginning, you can't juice a market when there's no money. There's no market. Like, market's an exchange of goods and services. There are no exchanges of goods and services happening in our economy right now.
Hey, pal. You just blowing from Stupid Town?
You know, I don't think I've ever seen anyone just completely and utterly cuckold every single argument they've made this fucking quickly. Yeah, you can't juice the market if there's no market. That's the problem with using stimulus. If the economy is not being productive, then that money you're just handing out is worthless. You know, I wish more people would debunk themselves like this guy. It would make my job a hell of a lot easier.
The only way to get the economy working back again is to defeat the virus. It's like the center of gravity for everything. We have to kill the virus, and we have to float the economy in the meantime.
You know, there's been diseases going around for all of human civilization, plenty of them way deadlier than COVID. Somehow, with all these diseases going around, we still manage to have a productive economy, still manage to be able to live our lives like normal. And one of the things that frustrates the crap out of me is when people blame the economic issues we're having right now on the virus. Saying the virus closed my business, the virus took my job, the virus did this, the virus did that. The virus didn't do jack fucking shit, okay? Virus is just a ball of DNA. It can't force you to close your business. And the reason authoritarians are blaming everything on the virus is because they want to distract you from the actual source of all the problems they're experiencing right now, and that's the very government they're kiss-assing to.
There's only one way to do that, and that is the government.
All hail our Lord and Savior, the government. They're the only possible way that we can solve all our problems. But in all seriousness, though, why exactly is it that the government is the only possible way to deal with this virus? I mean, they're regular Homo sapiens like you and me. They don't have any special magic powers. As a matter of fact, pretty much every medication for COVID-19, including the vaccines themselves, were developed by private sector companies. If anything, the government has actually done a lot to impede the development of these medications. There's actually been quite a few treatments and tests that were either delayed, if not outright barred, by the FDA. On top of that, someone figured out how to 3D print the N95 masks that kind of block the viruses, and the government told them they weren't allowed to do it because of patent infringement.
If the government did not do this, people would plunge into poverty because people would literally plunge into poverty. They would lose everything that they've amassed, some of the meager savings that they've been able to get since the 2008 financial crisis. And it would be, if the financial crisis would look tame to the amount of wealth that this would wipe out from the American economy, and especially working and middle-class Americans.
All those problems you're describing, people losing their jobs, people losing their businesses, people becoming homeless, people suffering financial issues, all of that is literally happening because of the government. This is why it sounds absolutely ridiculous when this guy comes in and says the only way to prevent all these things that the government is causing is the government. I mean, it would be like if someone broke both your legs but then bought you a wheelchair and said, see, because of me, you can get around now.
But I don't want to forget that it took Trump a while before he remotely grasped the scope of this crisis.
Oh yeah,
he was
terrible.
downplaying it,
right.
And the time that we lost in the beginning is in itself, a disaster. You compare to South Korea and the U.S. had our first cases arrive and test positive on the same day. South Korea, of course, has flooded the zone with tests and seem to have done a much better job of getting this thing under control quickly, which means that their economy will be able to get back to normal much more quickly. Trump there were no tests. There's still not nearly sufficient tests. So we still have no idea how widespread the virus even is.
So you're admitting that we don't entirely know how widespread the virus is, and yet you seem pretty certain on just how deadly it is. On top of that, as I've mentioned before, there's a good chance we'd have greater access to tests if it weren't for the government getting in the way. One test was so effective it could return results in as little as 15 minutes, and it was delayed for months by the FDA. Another thing they're probably not going to mention, for, well, obvious reasons, is that Japan and Sweden didn't lock down. They took a few minor extra precautions, of course, but for the most part, people in those countries lived a completely normal life through this whole pandemic. And yet, to this day, they have really low cases.
That failure to act in the beginning is going to have massive, massive consequences.
Yeah, the government is typically slow to react to things because they don't operate based on market signals, and there's usually some sort of bloated bureaucracy they have to go through to do anything. If you think a quick reaction would have made the difference here, then your best bet would be to go with the private sector.
And I don't want to overlook that. I also don't want to overlook the fact that if it wasn't for Tucker Carlson flying to Mar-a-Lago, risking, now we know, coronavirus, by the way, to tell Trump, you have to take this seriously. This is a war. This is your enemy. You have to wrap your head around this. I don't know that they would have ever gotten on board with it. So
yeah, the fact that it took someone to actually go out and go through all that effort to get somebody to act should kind of signal to you how shitty the government is at responding to problems.
So it's incredible how, just one act, one event, one person who has some influence with him coming to him and making the case over what reportedly was ours, how that turned the direction. But that makes me skeptical, more skeptical than you, that this is a lasting position for the GOP. And why? Because we know how influential those corporate powers and that money and that coziness and the jobs they all want to get when they leave Congress. We know how much that has corrupted our entire system on the left and the right. So you have to not just like fall into it in a moment of crisis. You have to be committed to it and fight for it every single day.
So the government is slow to react to problems. The government is easily corruptible by corporate influence. Both of these facts are glaring you straight in the face, yet you still insist that we rely on government to solve all of our problems. Getting back to the main point of this video, the idea that the whole coronavirus pandemic somehow debunks libertarianism, what is this entire situation we're in right now, if not a complete and utter vindication of what it is that libertarians have been saying for years now? Whenever the government tries to solve a problem, it usually just makes it worse. A disease with a less than 2% mortality rate, we could have probably easily dealt with this just by quarantining more vulnerable people as well as developing some medications to treat it. By taking these small reasonable measures, we could have probably been done with this whole thing in 2 months. But no, thanks to government trying to be helpful and solve the problem, we now have a global economic crisis over something that could have just been dealt with as any other seasonal illness. From businesses being forced to arbitrarily close to lockdown orders that make no fucking sense at all. I think quite the opposite actually of what these guys are saying. I think that this pandemic will stand historically as a testament to the incompetence and illegitimacy of government. And because of that, I think libertarianism is going to be on the rise from now on. Like, I've seen a fuck ton of people supporting Joe Jorgensen during this last election. I think that trend is just going to continue. Well, thanks for watching my official last video of the year. Thanks for watching. You folks enjoy your new year. This has been Philosophy Possum, making stupidity play dead. Until next time, have a good one.